Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here tonight, both in person and virtually, to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of Menaka Raman-Wilms' debut novel, The Rooftop Garden, to which you may applaud if you feel so inclined. This wonderful book is published by Nightwood Editions, and we're so grateful to them for coming to us and helping make not only the publication of this book, but also this evening a reality. You'll be hearing a little bit more about the book in just a moment, and I'm just going to offer a few brief housekeeping notes at the beginning of the evening, and then we'll move on to the real thing, which is why you're all actually here. So just a few quick notes. There'll be a reading just from this podium right here, and then we'll move along to a conversation of the chairs just to my left. Following that, there'll be an opportunity for all of you to ask questions. So if you're here locally, please just feel free to put up your hand and I'll wander over to you, Sally Jesse Raphael style, with a microphone and place it right in front of your face. This is not a comment on your ability to project. It's just to ensure that all those watching the video now or in the future can hear the question that you have as well. If you are watching online at the moment and have a question for Menaka, please feel free to write it in the chat and we'll put it to her as time permits. At the close of the event, we'll ask you all just to remain in place for one moment while we safely transport Menaka over to a signing table just beside the cash desk. But I'll have more completely thrilling news about signing procedure for you at the end of the event. But I won't take up too much more of your time because I personally would also like to hear quite a bit about this book. It's a beautifully wrought, incredibly hypnotic book with brilliantly drawn characters, one that we've been excited about launching here at the store and one that we're delighted to be celebrating here with you this evening. Your host for this evening, Keisha Paul, hosts CBC Manitoba's The Weekend Morning Show every Saturday and Sunday from 6 to 9 a.m. Keisha's curiosity shines during interviews, creating an authentic and open dialogue with all her guests. Keisha is a graduate of the University of Manitoba's Asper School of Business. Before joining CBC through the Pathways program, Keisha worked as a business consultant in the US, the UK, the Caribbean, and Canada. As a consultant with nonprofit Seed Winnipeg, Keisha was a Canadian delegate to the United Nations 62nd session of the Commission on the Status of Women. In 2013, she worked as a consultant for the winner of The Apprentice UK. Keisha is a proud child of immigrant parents from Trinidad and Guyana. She has spent time across the Caribbean, including in St. Kitts and Nevis, where she weathered the COVID-19 pandemic. Here to introduce Menaka Raman-Wilms, please join me in welcoming Keisha Paul.
John, what an intro. Thank you so much. And then he hides away. What a modest guy. Thank you. John, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I want to thank you all for coming. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be here to host this event, to spend it all with you, and of course, to learn more from the horse's mouth, if you will, about the Rooftop Garden. This is my first ever, if you can believe it, in-person interview that I have ever done, ever. Everything throughout this pandemic has been completely faceless, has been completely touchless. And I've just weathered the storm. This is my first in-person interview, so I'm extra thrilled for that. So yeah, let's have a hand for that. And I couldn't be happier that I get to interview this, I'm older than you, so I'm going to say young talent, for her first ever book launch. Menaka Raman-Wilms, rather. I'm glad that she's not my sister, and I'm glad that she's not my cousin, because she would put you to shame with the laundry list of accomplishments that she had. So I'm going to read a couple of them, okay? So now what she does is she hosts the Decibel. I really think that you should all check it out. It's a daily podcast that's put on by the Globe and Mail. And some of the subject matter that you get on that show, you won't get anywhere else. And it's just amazing that you bring that all to us. I also, she's also a writer. She's based in Toronto. She's a journalist, of course. Master's in creative writing from the U of T. But if that wasn't enough, she also got a master's in journalism at Carleton too, right? So, but like all of us, she's not a human doing. She's a human being. And what excites me so much about us spending this time with Menaka today is that we actually get to find out what makes her tick. Those shiny moments that we all get to see, those things that you'll all be able to read on her bio yourself. Those are the things that happen in the light. But what happens in the dark? What happens when she's alone and she's thinking and she's wondering about the world? And that's what we get when you read The Rooftop Garden. I can't say enough good things about it. When she's not doing all this impressive stuff, what is she thinking about? So after graduating, she actually didn't really know what to do. And she went to Germany and spent some time, particularly in Berlin, where much of this book is based. And when she wasn't doing much, if you will, and wasn't getting all these check boxes, ticking all these check boxes, if you will, is what inspired that time when she was relaxing, that time when she was reflecting, that time between things after graduating and going to a new job, is what inspired this book. That was the beginnings of this book, which she will share more with you right now. Do you want to come on?
Great, yeah.
Okay.
All right. Hi, everyone. That was quite an introduction. Thank you, Keisha. I will just start by saying I'm very thrilled to be here. It's wonderful to be here in Winnipeg. My favorite bookstore ever. This place is absolutely amazing. And I remember walking through here with my parents, I think one of my first visits to Winnipeg, and just being kind of awed by it. So it's actually really exciting to be here launching this book. I'm going to start by reading a chapter for you, if that works. It's early on in the novel, and so I think this is a good place to start to kind of set things up a little bit. I'm gonna have some water before I start. But basically, a little bit of the premise of the novel is just to give you a quick idea so you know where we're going when I start reading. The novel's about two friends, Nabila and Matthew, and it starts when the two of them are kids, when they're about 8 years old, and they're in Toronto, and they play on Nabila's, her parents live in an apartment building, and they play on the roof, and they have this space there that they play in. And the book goes back and forth between these imaginary games that they play as kids and when they're older, when they're in their 20s. And when they're older, Matthew's actually gone missing. He's disappeared in Berlin, and Nabila goes there to try to find him and try to bring him back. So this is early on in the novel. This is chapter 3, and this is just when we're starting to understand the kind of games that they play as children. Matthew hasn't heard about how cars are heating up the world, so Nabila tells him. She says it's why the ice at the North Pole is melting, and the more that everyone drives, the hotter everything gets. Soon the ocean will rise and swallow up Vancouver. She can only tell him things like that when Tara Lynn isn't listening, because sometimes Matthew gets scared. Then Nabila gets in trouble. So she waits until Tara Lynn is reading baby books with Samir on the other side of the rooftop, and then she and Matthew duck behind their hedges. It's only when they're in their secret forest hideaway that Nabila tells him things like that. This is why our forest really is on top of a building, Nabila says one day. Water flooded the city and everybody had to leave, and then trees just started growing all over the empty buildings. Their roots probably poked through the concrete and started breaking all the glass. Matthew is eating his after-school snack, a chocolate chip granola bar. He stops chewing and looks at her. A piece of granola sticks to his lip. Where did everyone go? He asks. Maybe some of them didn't make it. The rest went into the mountains. Why didn't we go with them? Nabila shrugs. We got left behind. Matthew's eyes get wide. The forest is eating the city and we're stuck on a building, he says quietly, his mouth still full. Nabila plants seeds so they can grow food. She digs 6 small holes in a row, drops in for 10 seeds, then covers them back up with dirt. She realizes that pieces from the granola bar would make perfect seeds. Maybe we tried to go too, she says, as she reaches over and picks up a few bits that Matthew dropped on the ground. But we got stuck. There was too much water. She digs new seed holes and places granola in each one. Matthew squeezes the last bit of the bar out of the wrapper and hands it to her, and she breaks it into little bits and then lays them on the earth. Don't waste the chocolate chips. He reaches over and picks them out and drops them on his tongue. Tara Lynn always remembers that chocolate is Matthew's favorite. Every Friday, she brings them an after-school treat, and Nabila notices the treats always have chocolate. Matthew has only been coming home with them for a few weeks. It started in mid-September when they were walking home one day and Tara Lynn noticed Matthew. He was walking up ahead of them, alone. Nabila wondered why he was allowed to go places on his own, and Tara Lynn said that they should invite him to join them. So the next day, when Nabila came out of school to meet Tara Lynn and Samir at the edge of the teacher's parking lot, Matthew stood there too. Tara Lynn handed them both Tupperwares of apple slices, and they walked home together. Tara Lynn said she'd arranged for him to stay with them after school until his sisters arrived to pick him up. Nabila wanted to say no, but her brother could barely just walk, so at least she'd have somebody her own age to play with. Matthew isn't in the regular grade 3 class like Nabila. He's in the 2-3 split, which everyone says is where they put the smart grade 2s and the stupid grade 3s. Nabila's never talked to him before, but she knows that some kids made fun of him because one time at recess, he'd picked up a frog and it had peed on his hand. Matthew turned out to be okay. When Nabila talks, he mostly just listens. She figured out that if she plans a game, he'll play it. And if she makes up the rules, he'll follow them. That's why they always play the forest game. It's Nabila's favorite. Her mother is a scientist and teaches Nabila a lot about the environment, including all the ways the world is changing because it's getting warmer. Humans cut down too many trees, and trees are the things that make the air pure. Then humans drive too many cars, and car pollution turns the air to poison. Glaciers melt and flood the ocean. Turtles swallow plastic bags because they look like jellyfish. Matthew doesn't seem to know any of that stuff. So while they play, Nabila tries to explain things to them. He scares easily. He listens to her with his mouth hanging open, his eyes round and too pale blue. When she tells him there's a big hole in the sky over the South Pole, he worries everyone will die when outer space rushes in. They always go to the rooftop after school. Tara Lynn and Samir sit in the gazebo, and Nabila takes Matthew to the garden to play. There's a small row of hedges, some rose bushes, and a few plants that have big leaves and don't grow very tall. There's also flowers. Then there are the 2 sandbar willows that tower over everything else. Nabila loves the trees. They have long, thin branches that stretch up towards the sky, and the leaves hide their forest from everyone else. That's where she and Matthew play, in the dirt between the plants where nobody else can see them. After an hour, they all go down to the apartment lobby, where Matthew's sisters wait to pick him up. The sisters both go to high school, and one has blonde hair and the other has pink. And they never hug Matthew, they just sometimes touch his shoulder. Once he leaves, they go back up to the apartment, and Tara Lynn finishes making dinner while Nabila does her homework. She sits on one side of the kitchen table, and Samir sits on the other, in his high chair, eating peas or bits of chicken, and sometimes rubbing it on his face to make Nabila laugh. Tara Lynn leaves when their parents arrive, just before dinner. Then Nabila's father pours 2 glasses of wine and a glass of grape juice before he changes out of his suit. He takes his wine to the bedroom and comes out a few minutes later in jeans and a t-shirt. Nabila's mother still wears her work clothes, and they all sit at the table and eat together. Nabila sits between her parents and takes little sips of her grape juice because that's how her mother drinks her wine. Samir sits opposite her in his high chair, fussing because it's almost bedtime. Matthew's father doesn't live at home. Nabila knows that, but she doesn't know why. It's just Matthew with his sisters and mother, and his mother works almost every evening. So Matthew says that they eat a lot of pizza. Nabila only gets to have pizza at birthday parties. When the granola seeds are all covered in dirt, Nabila decides that they'll make a bowl lined with waxy leaves to collect rainwater. Then they can water their plants, she tells Matthew. So he starts digging a hole with his fingers in the earth between them. When the seas begin to rise, Nabila's mother tells her, fresh water will become very precious. There won't be much of it left. They have to make sure they don't waste the bowl of rain, Nabila thinks. And then she notices that Matthew is watching her, waiting for what she will say needs to be done next.
Cool. And remind me of time if I'm going long, because I have a lot of questions.
Great.
Okay, so as we discussed just previously, I wanted to have a quick intro because I wanted to take time for this. You know, the inspiration for all of this was your trip to Berlin. So take me back there. First of all, why did you want to go to Berlin of all places you could go?
Yeah, so this was 7 years ago now. This was in 2015, and I went with my friend Grace, and we were both kind of at this point where we'd finished grad school, and I was kind of working a couple of jobs, but I hadn't really found anything yet. And we wanted to do something different. I'd never lived outside of Canada for more than like 6 weeks. So we thought, okay, you know what? We know both of us have been to Germany a little bit. We thought we'll go to Germany. I knew I'd loved Berlin before, so that's where we ended up. And it was really a fascinating time to be in Berlin, I think, because 2015, if you remember, that's when a lot of refugees came over to parts of Europe. Migrants were coming over to parts of Europe. There was a lot of politics going on around that as well. There was also the Paris attacks in November too. So it was a very kind of heightened, it felt like a very politically heightened moment, a very emotional moment too. People were really scared. And then like a lot of people were really desperate too. Like people were coming over to Berlin and there were big refugee centers set up, people just needing like basic food and winter coats and stuff. So it was I think it was a really fascinating time to be there. And that kind of set up a lot of the stuff that ended up here.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting because a lot of those themes that were happening in 2015 in a very stark way in Berlin now are so timely now here in 2022 in Canada. Mm-hmm. You know, the juxtaposition of the two places where this book takes place. It's in Toronto and it's also in Berlin. And I'm curious about those themes mixing, like during that time. Did you, as you were writing the book, because it did take seven years to get to this point. Yeah, it took a long time. Well, you could tell it's a good book. But like, what I'm wondering is this, like, were these influences kind of intermingled as you were going? Like, did you start to notice some of those things when you came back home?
Yeah, for sure. And I think like so there's a lot of initial places in Berlin that kind of inspired me there. But then when I came back to Toronto, in a big city, and you think about being next to big buildings all the time. I was working downtown. I was living right downtown at Young and Bloor. So you're just surrounded by giant buildings all the time. And so I think that kind of shaped a lot of the stuff that I was thinking about in terms of the rooftop, right, in Toronto. And then I was in Ottawa for a bit too. And it's funny, I feel like each place that I went to kind of ends up creeping into the writing process a bit. So like, yeah, just like the nature in Ottawa where I was walking along the canal a lot and there's lots of trees around, that kind of inspired a lot of that as well.
Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm going to jump a little bit, but just that excerpt that you wrote, it really takes you to the place where Matthew and Nabila spend so much time, where they create. And Nabila's taking charge of a lot of this. They're quite serious themes for children to be contemplating, like at 8 and 9 years old, about how starkly the world is changing and what the result is going to be in the future. Are those things that kind of keep you up at night?
So it's interesting, like, I mean, those are definitely things that, like, I think all of us should be pretty worried about climate change, right? And this is definitely something that's in my conscious and subconsciousness. But I think for people a little bit younger than me, so like Gen Z especially, this is, I think, in their, from what I can see at least, in their consciousness in a kind of a different way. Like, you've really grown up since a child knowing that this is happening and people around you accepting that this is happening, and you're not really seeing things being done about it. And I think that for people kind of that age, it really becomes part of your psyche in a way that I think anyone a little bit older maybe doesn't quite grasp. And so I think that's kind of really that's why these characters are in their 20s, because they, you know, even as adults, right, they've grown up with this reality, and you see when they're kids, like, yes, these are serious themes for kids, but like, this is the reality that a lot of kids do know these days, that this is what's happening.
Yeah, no, that is true. Throughout the book, well, actually, I should say, right now, we're living in quite politically and environmentally tumultuous times. These themes repeat in the book as well. What happened to make you settle on those two themes in that way while you were writing?
It's a good question. I don't know if it's a question I know the answer to directly, exactly. I know, I think, I'll do my best to figure this out. I mean, I think we talked about climate change already, kind of how that's in the psyche there. And I think when I was in Berlin, like when I talk about the Paris attacks, like you do think of this, the conversation around extremism really started to, I found, pick up there, or maybe I was just more aware of it as well. But there are two kind of things that I find are like people kind of, exactly, I'm trying to figure out exactly how I'm saying this, but like, they're two kind of very overwhelming things in a way. And so people either, like with climate change, you can take action against, you know, trying to mitigate it. So Nabila, as a scientist, she's trying to do good in the world, but she's actively trying to do something. But for a lot of people, that's a really overwhelming thing, right? And so, and I think kind of the same kind of desperation that people can feel with climate change is what can end up driving a lot of people to something like extremism. It's not necessarily a direct thing, but it's just like, if you're feeling overwhelmed and you're feeling like there's not a lot of options in your life, this is sometimes the emotions that can kind of push you in that direction. And so I think there was just some similarities there that I was trying to explore a little bit.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, and I don't know if you all took this away from the little bit. I hope you all read this book, and I'm sure you will, but at the beginning of that chapter, you see the stark difference between Nabila's life and Matthew's life. You see that Nabila is in a better financial situation. She's a little bit more educated at that point. And you also see that Matthew is struggling a little bit, but Nabila doesn't quite understand where he's coming from. But she has questions about it. I found it really interesting as I was reading the book that Nabila was the one who was kind of in a better state, if you will, and Matthew wasn't. Matthew's clearly a Canadian, typical, if you will, stereotypical Canadian kid. Was it intentional that you switched what we might typically see, like in media or in pop culture, in terms of the juxtaposition between like who was educated, who wasn't, who had money, who didn't, who was in a two-parent household and who wasn't? Was that intentional?
Yeah, it was. And you're actually the first and the only person, at least, to mention to me that that noticing and picking up on that, Keisha. Yeah, it was. And I think it's in a way, yeah, it's a little bit maybe of a flip of what we would expect. But I think also like it's the reality today though too, right? Like especially when you look at who can get sucked into the kind of extremist stuff, right? You know, I think we're starting to realize that anyone can, and everyone has vulnerabilities, and if people are prying on specific vulnerabilities, anyone can be susceptible if if people find your vulnerabilities, essentially, right? So, but yeah, that is a little bit of a flip there that I was, at least when I started writing, I wanted to do that.
Yeah, well, and it's not to say that it doesn't exist in reality. It definitely does exist in reality, but it's far less reported on. So if we did a word game, which we will not do because this is being recorded, but like if I said, you know, extremist, terrorist, whatever, there's an image that could come. And I just thought it was so interesting that you switched it. Especially with some of the socioeconomic things that were happening. So let's go back to Berlin a little bit. Lifespans of people who are, let's say, Canadian or even from Europe or whatever, steadily kind of going down. People are finding themselves in some really dire straits with regards to education, with regards to options in terms of like life options. And let's say for like the whether it's the global south or like brown communities or whatever, although it's not meeting, but kind of steadily going up. And extremism does play into that. And I think it's interesting throughout the book because you never really name some of the themes that these extreme themes that Matthew is susceptible to. Was that on purpose as well?
Yeah, that's very much on purpose. And I think the point that I'm hoping to, that I hope that you kind of take away from that is the idea that you don't really need to name it because at their core, a lot of these movements are very similar. There's a lot of very similar themes, methods, vulnerabilities that they use against people as well, that are replicated over and over and over again. And I guess that's part of the point, right? It could be any number of things, and it really doesn't necessarily matter in a way what motivates this group, because a lot of the time the end can be the same, their methods can be the same. And so hopefully that kind of, you know, just shows how interchangeable they are in some ways.
And you don't pigeonhole anybody. And I really appreciated that as I was reading the book. One thing I thought was really interesting is throughout, as you're reading the book, there's this interplay between the child's voice and the adult voice. So we go back and forth between children and kind of young 20-year-olds. What was it like to write in that way?
It was really fun. It was also challenging at times because it's actually really hard to write in a kid's voice, like to try to think about how does a kid see the world? Like, what are they thinking about? What do they know, right? How are they understanding things? So it was a fun challenge with that. But it also, I think it was good for me though to switch back and forth with the writing as well, because and hopefully when in the reading of it too, because I think you see kind of how, you know, an event in the child's life can sometimes, you know, affect where they end up, or maybe put them on a path that puts them in a different place, or vice versa, right? You see something that happens in your adult life and you can kind of trace it back to say, oh yeah, you know, maybe this kind of started at this point or something. So that kind of interplay, I think it served me in writing to remind me like how these two parts of the stories are connected, and hopefully it works as a whole.
Yeah.
Too, yeah.
Oh yeah. One thing, like as you're talking now, it occurred to me that as you're writing, you don't judge Nabila and you don't judge Matthew. Yeah, I found that it was non-judgmental, although like Matthew does find himself in some pretty tough situations. Often I find it's in regular life, we are judging people who are different than us, whether it's they're not as educated or whether they find themselves in tough situations or whatever. And there was no judgmental lens.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think for a story like this, like it doesn't, I don't know, I don't really feel like it has a place, because it's like this is this guy's reality, this is her reality, right? And it's just the way that they're interacting. It's not that you're trying to place judgment necessarily on any specific action or anything. It's just kind of exploring how these things happen.
Yeah, no, I think it just speaks to you as a person. I guess I'm giving you a compliment. I just realized as it was happening, when I was reading and as you're talking now, I realized that there's just no judgment between the two of them. And also I realized that an interplay you have as I was reading the book, it's male voice and female voice, and male voice and female perspective. What was it like switching between the two of those?
Yeah, that was actually, it's easier to write in a female voice for me, for sure. And I think a lot of writers say that too. So it is, again, it's kind of like an exercise, like when you're writing for a kid's voice, it's a little bit of an exercise for me to write in a man's voice because it's just like not my natural perspective. But yeah, that's a little bit challenging. But again, I think it's nice to be able to go back and forth between like what she's thinking and what he's thinking and how that works out, like how it plays together.
Did you have to do extra research to be able to do it so authentically?
Not for that part. Where I had to do research was the science stuff a little bit, because Nabila's a scientist and I'm not a scientist. So trying to figure out what a lab looks like, or like, is this an actual area of research with the seaweed and warming oceans, and how would this work, and where would you go to do this research and stuff. So that was the stuff that I actually had to do more research, and the plants in the garden. So I again, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a botanist, but my friend Grace, who I went to Berlin with, she's a landscape architect. And so she is always picking plants for certain areas and what grows well here and what works with concrete things. And so I kept asking her. I remember we used to go to like a specific coffee shop in Berlin, and she would sketch and I would write. And I'd like lean over and be like, so would this plant work? Or like, what kind of tree, could you have a tree on a rooftop? Like, what kind of tree could you put on there? So she would give me little, like that was my research for the plants.
That makes so much sense now. That makes so much more sense now as I'm going through, because it is so well done. And it's actually interesting that you say that now. Nabila, she is a scientist through and through. Like as she's a child, the way she speaks to Matthew, the way she analyzes things and into her adulthood, it's not just that she does science, like she is a scientist.
She's very practical, right, and logical with her thinking, and and it's very much kind of it's who she is. It's her life,
She gets incredibly uncomfortable in social situations at times. She's like, that definitely comes through. I wanted to know, like, what was it like to process? And we talked a little bit about this, like the processing of the climate change as a child, and what did you want the reader to take away from that?
I don't know if there's anything specific, honestly, that I want us to take away from, except to think about it more and to ruminate on it, and you know what the way that this is kind of happening over time. I think like the idea, especially of the fact that like kids growing up with this knowledge, like it is a pretty heart-wrenching thing to have 8-year-olds talking about how the streets are going to flood and we have to fend for ourselves because people are dying, and so I think like at least those scenes for me, it's a very visceral thing of like this is a reality that that people younger than me are really growing up with. That's kind of what hits me when I think about it.
Did you want people to think that one feeds into the other? Like that climate change and some of the dire straits that we'll find ourselves in, if things don't change in the good way, will feed into political and kind of social discourse?
You know what? I hadn't really thought of that until we started talking about it here. Not directly, anyways. But I mean, I'm certainly there are the two themes that kind of intersect within the story. But yeah, I mean, I guess we kind of see that too, like with we see the not art attacks, but like, the throwing of stuff on paintings with glass on and stuff. But still, like we are seeing like actions, people are taking more drastic actions with that. So there's kind of probably a bit of crossover there, but it honestly wasn't an intentional thing that I was putting in there.
No, it's fair. I'm trying to think, like, I want to just spend a little bit more time in regards to like the choice of Nabila and the choice of Matthew, like, because Matthew, as you read the book, you'll find that Matthew's very sad. Matthew's having a really difficult time, like throughout the book. I don't want to give anything away, but I'm just like, Matthew is quite a sad character. And Nabila, one thing that I found really interesting is that when I'm used to reading books is like you'll have a female lead or female character, and she does not in this book spend a whole bunch of time, although she does try to help Matthew. She's not that, like I need to save him, I love him, you know, I have this.
She's very
underlying-
practical.
Yeah. Like, I mean, was that on purpose to not make her like have this kind of like typical archetype with regards to what we're used to with female characters?
I mean, this is just honestly, this is just who Nabila kind of is. Like she is a scientist. She's a daughter of the scientist, right? And this is kind of her journey through the world. Like I think a lot of Nabila's interactions with Matthew is kind of, yes, as you say, she's trying to help him, but it's all within like a sphere of her own life too. But I think what does come through too, or I hope it comes through, is you do see Matthew as he is a lonely guy. Like he is when he's a kid and also when he's an adult. But I think you start to realize too that Nabila's kind of lonely too. Like, you know, she picks up from her life to go to Berlin to try to find this guy that she doesn't honestly know very well. And so even as Matthew's kind of outwardly very lonely and, you know, all the things in his life seem very lonely, she's actually kind of equally lonely. Like there's a scene in the book where she talks about her job and how she works all the time. She's in the lab and she loves it. And she has 2 other colleagues that they go out with like once a week and stuff. And it's her favorite night of the week because she doesn't go out that much, right? And so in some ways, like Matthew needs her, but like she kind of needs Matthew in a way too.
Poverty is something that really struck me while I was reading this book. It's just kind of like poverty of options with regards to Matthew, poverty, like economic poverty, just all the different ways that played out. And as I was reading the book and I was reflecting in terms of like socially what's happening in our country, even more people finding themselves in this very isolated place. And maybe after the pandemic, it rang true a whole bunch for me as I was reading the book.
It kind of maybe it feeds into the loneliness a little bit too, right? Like when you're facing something like climate change, it's and you know there's not collective action. You feel a kind of loneliness. I don't know if that ties into the poverty stuff.
Well, yeah, no, it just I just noticed that was like a theme. Just how sad it was. And how much that played into how hard his life was just being poor in the different areas of being poor. Like it was like in every single area he was just really poor and isolated.
Like financially, emotionally, like he doesn't have parents around, right? His sisters kind of not really raise him, but they're responsible for taking care of him and things.
And what happens to somebody when that happens? Like it was like one thing that was probably one of my favorite parts of the book is the gained humanity you have for Matthew, because you see what happens when a little kid is treated this way, and you also see what the result is as a young person 10 or so years later, what can happen to somebody who's been impoverished in that way.
Well, that's the kind of thing, like when I talked about the vulnerabilities, right, a little bit earlier, that's the kind of thing, like his childhood kind of set him up to be vulnerable in very specific ways. Like he needed companionship and he wanted friendship and just to be seen by people, right? And someone's willing to give you that, someone's willing to give you that attention and bring you into a fold and into a community and make you feel a part of something. That's really hard to turn down, right? Why would you want to turn that down? But the thing is that usually comes with a bunch of other stuff too, which is what ends up happening with Matthew.
As we're talking now, I'm realizing that there was all these kind of ways that Matthew could have been like almost like helped before things got as extreme as they did. Was that almost like a lesson to readers?
Again, I don't really think of it as a lesson, but like it certainly is something that you think about when it's like, oh yeah, there's all these instances of like, yeah, if he had a couple other friends, if someone else reached out, or if he'd stayed in touch with someone, like if he had any just other like kind of lifelines there, he would have had other options. So yeah, I mean, it really is, it's kind of showing what happens when all slowly those lifelines are gone or they don't exist, yeah, where you can end up.
And the effect it has on everyone else once everything's said and done. Like, yeah, you know, let's go back because I can see our time is wrapping up quickly. And going back to like when you first inspired to write this book, and it took its time, and now we're here. What's it like for you now with this finished product, and you're on your journey with it now? Like, what are you hoping people get from the book? Let's start there.
Yeah, it's amazing. You said like I started writing it 7 years ago, and it's really funny as an author because the majority, you're just alone in your room, right? Like writing, and that's all the book is. You're the only person who knows these characters, and all of a sudden it's like out there and other people know who these people are and the story and everything. So it's very exciting. It's times it's a little weird, but it's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it feels really, it's exciting to see like the everything kind of come together in that way.
Moving forward, is there anything that you want to have, like any lasting impression, like when everyone goes, they get the book and they go to that last page and it's done? What do you want them like to keep with them? Like what feeling or what thought do you want them to hold with it once they finish the book?
Well, I hope they thought it was a good read. That would make me happy. I mean, I think it's just the idea of like being able to sit with these characters for a bit and really explore these themes. I mean, the beauty of a book is it's different than a movie in the sense that it takes us, you know, usually a few hours to read over a few days, maybe even weeks or months, right? So it's stuff that kind of, I think, percolates in the background. Even when we're not actively reading, we're thinking about something that we read or piecing things together. And so I think kind of the duration of spending this amount of time with these ideas and people, you know, characters who are working through these ideas, I hope that just resonates with people.
Well, it certainly resonated with me, and I can't wait till it resonates with all of you. Thank you so much for our time.
Thank you, Keisha.
And now if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to just put up your hand and I'll wander over to you with the microphone.
I also just noticed there's this, I mean, I noticed the tree, but I was connecting this beautiful tree to this perfectly, atmosphere is perfect. Thank you, John.
We brought it in just for the lunch. Oh, yes.
Thanks, Dad.
Yeah, kick it off. Yes, I was wondering in my reading of the book, Menaka, there was a particular place in Berlin of this, it was sort of this very spooky scene where the characters had a friend of Nabila took her into sort of an adventurous place and to creep underneath a fence, and they're looking at all these sort of weird sort of things like a Ferris wheel and swans. Could you describe that? Because I think it was very evocative of the scene, and they're chased by dogs.
Yes. I do love talking about this scene. This is one of my favorite scenes in the book. It's an old abandoned amusement park in Berlin, and it's fictionalized in a book called The Fairy Forest Amusement Park, but it's based on a real place, and it's Spray Park in what used to be East Berlin, and it was shut down and everything was kind of abandoned, and then like the forest just kind of grew over it, and it is like a very spooky place because you've got like these statues, and you've got like a Ferris wheel and a pirate ship and stuff, but then you've just got trees and grass growing over things, these swan boats that are kind of abandoned on the side of like the old pond with like some of them are missing heads, and there's graffiti and everything. It's very much like fairy tale but turned upside down kind of thing. I love that. So when Grace and I were in Berlin, we were trying to explore Berlin and find all these cool places. And there are a lot of cool places in Berlin. And we found this place online. We're like, oh, this looks so cool. And it's closed, but we were like seeing that like, okay, you can sometimes go to like a concert or something that's there. They hold events there. So we got tickets to this random concert. I don't remember what it was, but we just went so we could go into the amusement park, and it was amazing. Like you just walk by all of these things, and there's a giant Ferris wheel that's like falling apart, and like it would like creak a little bit still, and just very, very spooky and cool. But yeah, that's one of my favorite scenes in the book, when they do sneak into the amusement park and run around and get scared, and yeah, I think it's an interesting scene too.
So there wasn't really a concert. You actually snuck into this. Yeah. So that's what really happened. Like, let's not play games.
So we actually thought about it. We were like, oh yeah, this seems doable. But then we were like reading online that people do sneak in, but they chase you with dogs sometimes. So we're like, maybe not.
Maybe not.
That's the idea. So then we were too chicken to do that. So we did buy tickets to this concert.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm very excited to read the book. I haven't got it yet, so I don't really have any specific questions about the story, but I am kind of curious to know a little bit about your writing process. So you took 7 years to write it. Was this something that came in fits and starts, or did you have like a process? Were you like a weekly or daily writer? And going forward for the next book, do you have a way that maybe a process that you learned from the first book that you might apply going forward?
Yeah, it did take a long time, and it is hard to keep kind of the consistency over time. And there were definitely moments that were more focused and ones that were less focused. But my rule throughout most of it was that I had to write at least one sentence a day. And it seems so minuscule, and it is like that'd take you forever to write a book if you're just writing one sentence a day. But the point of that was that, yes, some days I would sit down and write a lot longer, but I had to revisit the book every single day. Like, I had to remember where I was and what was happening to these characters and the thought process from the day before, and I had to add a little bit to it. And it's so more than just like producing more each day. The point was that I was forcing myself to go back to the work each day, because otherwise I found, like, when I initially started, if I hadn't gone back to it in a week, I was like, I don't remember what I was doing. What was I thinking about, right? And so that one sentence a day just really kept it very, very present for me. Yeah, so I think I would do that going forward too, because it really helped me along. It helped keep me motivated too, because you feel like even if you're not making a lot of progress, you're at least doing something. So
That's excellent advice. That was an excellent question. Yeah, you want to trade or what? Yeah.
And were there any other questions at all?
So both Matthew and Nabila throughout the book, you said something in the interview about both Matthew and Nabila being very lonely, and they both meet people who kind of pull them out of their loneliness a little bit, except that for Matthew, it's someone who takes advantage of this loneliness to turn them towards something very dark. And Nabila, well, the worst that she gets out of it is that she gets chased out of the amusement park by dogs. I was wondering, is that something that you intended with the two characters, to have a certain reflection of their experiences with the people that they meet and who kind of pull them out of a little bit out of their zone, but for different reasons?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's think about that for a second, Alex. I think, yeah, they have different experiences, but it's also because Nabila is a little bit more resilient with stuff. Like, she's not going to get pushed around as much as Matthew kind of does. She knows her boundaries a little bit more than he does. And I think they're both, like, so Tyranny, who's Nabila's friend, I think you're talking about in Berlin, she challenges Nabila a bit because she's more extroverted, and she tries to just be friends with Nabila essentially, right? And you can see Nabila kind of enjoying it, but she knows she has her boundaries, right? And when they get pushed too far, like, she steps back and things. Whereas Matthew doesn't really have that. He doesn't exactly know what's too far, or like if he's uncomfortable to stop something. So that's I think the difference there. So even if the loneliness is kind of the start for those interactions, they end up in different places just because they're two different people. Yeah. That's an interesting question. It's funny, the loneliness stuff hasn't, like, we've done a couple other events, but we haven't actually talked about the loneliness stuff much. So I'm glad this is coming out now, because this is something I was thinking a lot about with the book, that like, you outwardly see Matthew is fairly lonely, but like, if you would kind of look through the way that Nabila responds to a lot of stuff too, like, she's feeling it almost equally.
You started the book in, I believe you said 2015?
That's right, yeah.
And then in 2019, the pandemic happened. Did that shape the storyline at all? Did Did those events factor into your thinking?
That's a good question too. I haven't had that question either. I don't think it necessarily shaped what went into the book. It gave me a little bit more time to write because I wasn't doing much of anything else. So that certainly helped kind of move it along, I would say. But I think maybe the things that came out of the pandemic maybe shaped the book. That's a little cryptic, but just kind of the kind of revisitation of like political, like the polarization that kind of happens and just the anger that comes out of that we've seen in the last little while, like that kind of probably was reinforced in the book because that's something that is, was all around us, kind of is all around us when we look at a lot of different conversations that are happening as a result of the pandemic. So it was probably, if anything, it probably kind of reinforced that theme.
And were there any further questions at all?
There's some itching and scratching, and it looks like a question. It looks like the beginning of a question. So let's just go there. Just do it. Ask it.
Can I say one more thing about Berlin that we didn't get to talk about
Yes.
that I love talking about for Berlin? So I was saying, like, there's the political stuff that was there that was kind of inspiration for a lot of things, but a lot of the physical spaces in Berlin really inspired the book too. So the amusement park was one, but just the kind of the collision of like natural spaces and urban spaces in Berlin was something I found really fascinating. And I'm sure a bunch of cities are like this, but it's very unique in Berlin because I think of the destruction that happened with the wars, and also the fact, of course, there was a literal wall through the city and parts of the city were blocked off from each other for so long. And there were a lot of areas that kind of just were never repaired. And so you see buildings with certain bullet holes, or you see just like places just haven't been developed in so long, and then nature just kind of grew over the train tracks or through parts of an old building, right? And I remember seeing a picture, it was one of the museums that had been bombed out from like in the war and then hadn't been quite repaired in a timely manner. And for a period of time, there was an open staircase area and there was a tree like growing up at the top of the staircase. And so there's all these kind of collisions of these natural spaces or these like urban spaces that nature's kind of taken over again.
Mm-hmm.
And that like really, I found that fascinating and beautiful and kind of amazing. And when we're talking about climate change, like the idea of, the oceans rising and reclaiming streets and things like that, it kind of all, it seemed to be like a reality that was happening there that, it kind of a glimpse almost into a future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. I wanted to say that.
And thank you both very much. If you have any closing comments you might like to offer at the end of the evening, please do go ahead, and then I'll let these people know about the signing procedure.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here. It's really fun to be able to do this in Winnipeg in this great bookstore and to be able to talk about this book that's just been in my head for so long. It's amazing and it's really wonderful.
Yeah, and I want to say thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for sharing the space, and thank you so much for what you brought with this. This is my first, as I said, this is my first in-person interview, and it was absolutely a joy. And I really did mean it at the beginning, where it's like you see somebody who's just, you've done so many things, like you've done like all that shiny stuff. But for me, what's interesting when I get to speak to an author, I get to speak to a content creator, is like, what makes them tick when we're not seeing like, oh, like your LinkedIn profile or all these things. It's just like, no, but what's actually like making them run? What's motivating them? The story behind the story. You know what I'm saying? And I find that really, really cool. I can't wait to see what else you do, but take a break and enjoy this first. And we'll go with that. And I'm so excited for your future. Thanks, Keisha. Welcome. Yeah.
Thank you both so very much. And thank you all for your attention, for your questions here this evening. We are now going to move along to the signing portion of the evening. So we're going to be safely transporting Menaka just to a table beside our cash desk where she'll be signing copies of the book. So we'll ask you all just to remain in place for one moment while we safely situate her over there. And then you're welcome to wander over and join us to get your book signed. Now, you don't need to pay for your book before you get into the signing line. We have copies available at the table. We have copies available at our cash desk. All we ask is that you please do pay for the book at some point this evening. Other than that, we're so very thankful to have had Keisha Paul here to perform her first in-person interview. And that's just a taste of the intelligence, the warmth, and the inquisitive humor that she brings to all of her interviews. So if you are at all interested, and I hope you are after enjoying this evening, please do join her on the weekend morning show on Saturdays and Sundays from 6 until 9. I also encourage you all to join me in celebrating the person we are here to hear from, and that would be Menaka Raman-Wilms. Thank you very much for joining us.